Hi, my name is Juan Matute. I'm the Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. As you all know, we are celebrating 100 years of transportation research at UCLA, and we do so by acknowledging the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles region, which was here prior to the initiation of transportation research at UCLA, or the University of California Southern Branch at the time. And funding for this series is provided by the Harvey S. Perloff Endowment. If you don't know who Harvey Perloff is, maybe you haven't taken histories and theories of planning yet or been across the way to the Perloff building, but is the founding chair of the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UCLA. So who are we? We're the Institute of Transportation Studies. We study transportation. But our predecessor groups at UCLA included the Albert Russell Erskine Bureau for Street Traffic Research at UCLA that was headed by Miller McClintock. So that was 100 years and 1 month ago that was founded. And so to our knowledge, UCLA was the first university in the United States to have a home for transportation research.
That's our story, and we're sticking to it.
Yes. And then in post-World War II era, the Institute expanded into, or UCLA's transportation research expanded into traffic safety, environmental issues, and transportation engineering. With the advent of that school, headed by Harvey Perloff, the Department of Urban Planning started attracting scholars who had interests in social and behavioral aspects of travel. And then in the 90s, we established a new research center that was based in policy and planning and transportation, which is still fairly unique within transportation research centers. And then about 10 years ago, we became part of a multidisciplinary, multi-campus statewide research consortium. One of the research areas that we are known for is parking policy, and we have recently launched a UCLA Center for Parking Policy. If you are joining us online and interested in learning more, you can go to the link on your screen or the QR code. We are raising money to endow this center in the name of the man pictured here, Donald Shoup. And so today's talk on LA's transportation history is from Professor Brian Taylor. How many of you have taken a course with Professor Brian Taylor? Okay, how many of you plan to take a course with Professor Brian Taylor? Okay, make sure you do that. Okay, that's my advice to you. So I took a course with Professor Brian Taylor, and then I found myself working for him for more than a decade in the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA. And I have the benefit of learning from Brian both in a course, but then outside of the confines of a course as him being my supervisor. And so I'm very much looking forward to his talk today, because it turns out some of the things we're doing in transportation, like fighting traffic congestion, we've been doing for a bit. Brian.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, so we switch here. And then, oh. Do you have notes?
No.
Okay.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate y'all coming out. And my apologies to those who happen to listen to me yammer twice a week for an hour and 20 minutes sitting here again on a Tuesday. So I want to begin with a premise, and that is that traffic congestion is frustrating, wasteful, and costly. So I know I'm going out on a limb here, but I just want to put that as something right out front. And I also want to suggest that the purpose of the transportation system is not to eliminate or even reduce congestion in terms of the purpose. It's instead, and many of you have heard this from me, to facilitate social interactions and economic transactions for all by conveying people and goods to their destinations, and in a way that minimizes the many negative externalities of travel, including congestion delays, which is a very different way of putting it. It's not the purpose is not to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's not to reduce congestion, but it's actually to enable people to get to destinations, goods to destinations, and do so in a way that minimizes these problems. However, because traffic congestion is such an obvious and frustrating problem in so many cities, we can come to see it as the prime directive of transportation planning in Star Trek parlance. This has often been the story in LA over the past century, where it really seems as though the purpose of what we're doing is to try and reduce congestion. And the same can be said more recently for vehicle emissions and public safety and health, which are truly pressing problems associated with transportation problems, but again, not the purpose of transportation planning in particular. And that is sort of something I want to use to think about how we've tried to organize things over the last bit. So for example, a global pandemic or an economic depression can reduce these negative externalities of travel, but by eliminating rather than improving travel. Problem solved? Well, then we start to see that it actually is good to be able to get around. Now, with that, this premise, fighting traffic congestion has guided transportation planning in LA for at least a century. And it has been the raison d'etre for many a planner. So with Harvey Perloff, Juan mentioned a little bit, I just want to acknowledge that he was a giant in the field of planning, thought, and practice, was a young implementer of a lot of New Deal policies and programs. He was the founding dean of the precursor to the Luskin School, the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UCLA. His passing preceded my time here. It occurred almost exactly when I started my master's program in urban planning at UC Berkeley. Perloff was a valued mentor to both Donald Shoup and Martin Wax, both of whom recently passed away themselves, but longtime established folks here. And I did have the pleasure to get to know Mimi Perloff, Harvey's dynamic spouse, who lived into her mid-90s and was really a positive force here on campus. So I also want to acknowledge that that Professor Wax and Peter Chesney, who spoke in the first in this series, as well as Yuhang Huang, who is a doctoral student here, did put together a monograph, A Century of Fighting Traffic Congestion in Los Angeles, 1920 to 2020. It's a more thematic look at the various approaches that have been taken to looking at these things. And for those of you who are interested in this, I recommend it to you. But what I'm going to do is somewhat different than that. My plan is to briefly talk about 6 plans, all for LA, all developed between 1924 and 1958, and all motivated in one way or another by the scourge of mounting traffic congestion in the region. 3.5 of the plans were implemented. I had it actually at 3.25, and then I thought that was getting a little narrow. So 3.5, 2.5 were not. And I want to reflect on what was, what is, and what might have been for this great city based on kind of the review of these plans. So that's what I'm going to try and do. So now let's go back 50, 100, 150 years ago in the Wayback Machine and consider congestion in the City of Angels. So here is a shot from a hot air balloon in 1887. So pre-drones and pre-Google Earth. Looking at what the city of Los Angeles looked like in 1987. And the hill there to the left of the development, I believe, is where Dodger Stadium would be sitting today. And looking across the LA River there. So in the late 19th century, about this time, LA was mostly an agriculturally based walking city, fairly focused. Well, New York was a major industrial metropolis with over 1 million inhabitants. So there's just enormous differences between the two regions. In 1869, the Plaza Church on the left still exists. We've got Union Station around there. So 1870, the census, again, less than 6,000 in LA City and adjoining towns. And the total regional population was about 30,000 people. So quite small 150 years ago or so. So Los Angeles matured after what we might call these various eras, and those of you who've had me in the past, these various transportation eras of urban development. We first talk about walking cities, where basically the main way that people got around was by foot. And cities, their streets were scaled to foot travel. Then we had the omnibus, which was essentially just a horse-drawn cart with seats in it that would drag people through the mud in bouncy rides and allowed for a little longer distance travel for some folks, And then the horse car era was really a big change where you took those same horse-drawn carts and put them on rails, and they were out of the mud and could travel much more easily and quickly, and cities started to expand as a result. All of that occurred before LA had 10,000 people in it. Then the next eras were the streetcar era, where we see a spider shape develop, and I'm gonna show you some pictures of that for LA. And then after that, what we might call the freeway era, where much urban development has occurred. So New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, Baltimore, all had a significant share of their periods of development in that walking city era. Well, cities like Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, almost all of their development was during the freeway era. And LA sits between those two, and is not nearly as sprawling by many measures as these cities on the right. So there were big changes over this period where I first was showing you the picture. So in 1876, San Francisco grows up around an enormous natural harbor. The Southern Pacific completes its cross-country rail line from east to San Francisco, of course, with the loss of many lives in constructing it of immigrant labor. And this disadvantaged economic growth in Los Angeles. By 1881, 5 years later, Los Angeles was linked to the national network like by a branch line. You know, we were akin to Bakersfield or some other sort of secondary city. And a comparative backwater with no natural harbor and no direct rail connection to the east. But LA had the advantage of sitting on the largest flat coastal plain on the entire Pacific Ocean. So if you go all the way up to Alaska, around Japan, Korea, China, all the way around back up Latin America, there is no place where there's that much flat land on the Pacific as there is in LA. And you also have a remarkable Mediterranean climate. So this was touted by boosters, and the cities began to grow. So from 6,000 in 1870, it went to 50,000 in 1890, 100,000 in the county. This is a huge increase, right? 320,000 in 1910. And there was lots of boosterism, selling access to recreational travelers, selling LA as this remarkable Eden to migrants, mostly migrants from Europe, but from around the country to come to Los Angeles. And it really, during this time, was a streetcar city. LA streetcars and buses and later cars kind of were proliferating. The LA Basin became home to the most extensive streetcar network on the planet. Now remember, we're still just a growing metropolitan area, and yet it had the most extensive streetcar network on the planet. There was lots and lots of lots that were subdivided, and had a big ribbon cutting ceremony here for Boyle Heights in 1889 for that suburb. You want to go out into the burbs from the central area, you could go all the way out to Boyle Heights. So it gives you an idea of where the scale of the city was at this time. So in 1925, there were 500,000 subdivided but vacant single-family lots in the region. 55% of the lots had been, of all of the lots in the region had been developed in any way. So it's not of those 500,000, but of all the lots. So 45, more than half the lots were not developed. By 1930, some 93.7% of LA residences were single-family homes. For Chicago, Boston, New York, the figures were about 53% of the total. And in 1930, the residential density of LA was 2,812 people per square mile. In New York, it was 23,000. So still enormous differences in the two places. So it just gives you an idea of some of the streetcars and how they were changing and modernizing. These are the four lines that a lot of it is what the blue line or the A line is on now, headed south from downtown. You know, you can think of light rail transit as an instrument of sprawl. So this is a look at some of the streetcar lines. These are the Pacific Electric streetcar lines. You see the thinner lines there on the top left on the west side. That was Larry. That was another streetcar company. So those are little thin lines, but you can see the extent of that. And in fact, this is the regional extent. So you can see this is absolutely an enormous area. that's covered by streetcars with many, many stations aimed at moving people from small little hamlets, little villages into parts of the city. And you can see the lines going from south to Orange County, Santa Ana, Long Beach in the port, out to Santa Monica, and even out as far as San Bernardino and cities out there. So that enormous plain was being covered with streetcar tracks and rapidly encouraging development. So during this time, electrification was really the key to all of this. There was a shift from horse-drawn to electric streetcars that occurred. The horse-drawn streetcars started around 1860, so going back earlier. In around 1890, the first streetcar was developed for Richmond, Virginia, and it was a dramatic revolution. So there was a huge transportation pollution problem in cities during this time, and that pollution problem was horse manure. It was staggering, massive piles, trillions of flies, spreading disease. It was a public health issue. Horses would die and the carcasses would be left in the streets. It was significant. And so you had this electric streetcar that brought about not only faster, quicker, more reliable service, but one that cut down public health issues significantly in the region. So there were enormous pollution and public health benefits from this change. As I mentioned, the first revenue service in Richmond, Virginia, 1888, and it spread literally like wildfire around the US and around the world. The only thing I can think of it is akin to the spread of mobile phones, in that there was already a network in place. There were horse car tracks all over the place. What it was is the propulsion technology changed. It was so superior in terms of cleanliness, in terms of speed, in terms of reliability, and cost, much cheaper because it was very expensive to stable and feed and keep horses going and trading them in and out, so that it lowered the cost, increased the speed, improved health, and it spread wildly. So it was just fast, reliable, and inexpensive. And what happened is that fares went down, and so where the omnibuses were a conveyance of the rich, streetcars became working people were able to get around on these streetcars. And so this transportation breakthrough came online just as LA was taking off. So right at that period. And the streetcars were getting bigger, if you can see from ones I was showing you earlier. And one of the things that happened is, and this just picture I wanted to show, but it skips ahead a little bit in the story, is often the streetcar would be operating on exclusive right-of-way in the middle of the street. The median, the neutral ground, was elevated, a wide median, and there'd be streetcars, and you would walk out into the center area, wait for the car, and travel. If any of you have ridden on the streetcars in New Orleans, for example, a lot of them are like that. But what happened is there was a growth. You can see this is a post-war picture, if you look at the models of the cars, that there was now an enormous shift from streetcars to cars, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and those medians were often paved over and shared with the cars, in part because people say, hey, the streetcars come by every 10 minutes or so. That neutral ground is being unused. Well, let's just have cars travel in there as well. Well, that ended up being a Faustian bargain for the streetcar companies. So the massive reduction in horse droppings was a boon, but congestion began to rear its ugly head. The city itself was urbanizing at an amazing rate. Not only was streetcars being used very heavily, but now you had the rise of automobiles. Here's a quotation from that period talking about sort of the congestion within the streetcar. So inside the air was a pestilence. It was heavy with disease and the emanations from many bodies. Anyone leaving this working mass, anyone coming into it, forced people into still closer, still more indecent, still more immoral contact. A bishop embraced a stout grandmother. A tender girl touched limbs with a city sport. Refined women's faces burned with shame and indignation, but there was no relief. Was this a prison? Was it a hall devoted to the pleasures and habitudes of vice? Was it a punishment for the wicked? No, gentle reader. It was only the result of public stupidity and apathy. It was a Los Angeles streetcar on the 9th day of December in the year of grace, 1912, and also any other old day you were in mind to board a streetcar between the hours of 5 and 7 in the afternoon. So this, as the city was growing, the system was just overrun with passengers. And I would also note that even today, issues of crowding and sexual harassment occurs on vehicles, and it's alluded to here as well. So with the rise of the automobile, you had early on things that were pretty clumsy, often used out in rural areas. There were frequent accidents, rookie drivers, high speeds, mixing of traffic. There's a lot of class warfare because these were kind of playthings of the rich. And there were some riots against all of these automobiles being used basically for running around. There were anti-auto incidents, stonings, firecrackers, riots, a shootout, and terrible congestion almost from the get-go. So part of it was that there was just chaotic use of these vehicles. So with this shift, car prices began to drop precipitately. And this is really important because over time, they were becoming better and better, more reliable, easier to use. They started to develop suspension systems, coverings, windshields, a variety of things that made them more useful in inclement weather. And at the same time, each year they got better, they got cheaper. So in 1909, it took 22 months of an average worker's wages to buy a Model T. By 1925, a superior version of that, it was down to about 3 months. So what happened is that you would just see a more and larger share of the population owning these vehicles and using them. And of course, it was not only creating lots of congestion for the cars, it was now significantly diminishing the utility and the operation of the streetcars as well. So U.S. auto registrations, 1905, there were 8,000 registered vehicles. In 1915, over 2.3 million. In 1925, over almost 17.5 million. So enormous growth. And in 1912, in LA, is when the number of horses operating the street were outnumbered by the number of motor vehicles. So that was sort of the tipping point there. So LA was increasingly overrunning by cars. So what's a planner to do? So the first plan I want to discuss was in response to LA's traffic crisis of the early 1920s, and it was prompted by the business community, which created a traffic commission. So one thing you should understand is that the whole planning profession hadn't been so thoroughly established within the public sector at this point. And lots of the planning work was at the behest of business and financial interests. They would form these organizations that touted their city and often the viability of where the land was owned in downtown areas. And this was pretty common that a lot of the plans that were developed were by these kind of private, not necessarily empowered organizations. The Traffic Commission in Los Angeles had a 24-member major highways commission, and it was a lot of powerful and influential people, mostly from the private sector, but there were some public sector folks. They hired celebrity planners, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., Charles Chaney, and Harlan Bartholomew to prepare a major traffic street plan for Los Angeles. As an aside, and work that I did for a book, Harlan Bartholomew was a remarkably influential planner. He was also a virulent racist who was very interested in trying to segregate the cities that he was trying to improve the transportation systems. So what did they start to do? One of it was to develop some rules for the road so that things weren't so chaotic. And Tom Vanderbilt, who's written about congestion, has pointed out that a lot of these rules applied to pedestrians as much or more early on than to motor vehicles. So streets were sort of places where people crossed at any point. You know, businesses could set up carts in the street. There was just all manner of urban activities went on. And you started to say, well, this part of the street is for movement of vehicles. This part is where pedestrians belong. Commercial activities have to go elsewhere. So it was sort of dividing up those uses. And what were called major traffic street plans became a thing. And they were developed for cities all over the country. And often the same group of people would go around and kind of rehash them with local context and develop them. They often started to talk about hierarchies of streets rather than just a mishmash of streets. You started to say, we're going to have a hierarchy with higher movement, lower movement. We're going to have some signalization. Early on, that might be handheld things that would tell people to hold at a signal. Widening streets, that often meant shrinking sidewalks, but trying to make more room for motor vehicles. Straightening streets, and there's some logic to this, is that by taking out a lot of turn movements, it increased speed and reduced pollution, reduced crashes by trying to make them connect. They'd often take bits of property of two streets that met just slightly off to bring them together. And it's why as you drive around now, you sometimes notice you might jog one way or the other. And again, elimination of jogs, tried to have a minimum number of dead ends, and segregating different types of traffic as much as they could. So in many ways, and this is a picture from New York, not Los Angeles in the top, streets moved from being complete multi-purpose spaces that serve the social needs of city dwellers to more incomplete spaces that served as traffic conduits for streetcars and vehicles. And this shows sort of where the pedestrians are where they belong, the streetcars are where they belong, the cars are where they belong according to these plans. But it did allow things to move more effectively. But the number of cars just kept growing. There were more rules of the road. There was more effort to segregate and separate modes so that the trucking was separated, for example. There were more elaborate intersection controls and some of the first electronic control of intersections. More efforts to try and rationalize these networks and actually push through boulevards, for example, where there were none. So Olympic Boulevard, for example, was cut through in advance of the 1932 Olympics to make it easier to get from one side of the town to the other. And lots of parking regulations. There began left turn pockets where you pull into that lane and the traffic passes by you to turn left. And then this hierarchy of local streets, minor collectors, major collectors, minor arterials, major arterials, highways, expressways, and then of course freeways at the end. So this idea that vehicles would move across these hierarchies and have different kinds of trips. So here's a map of what was planned out for this major traffic street plan. Downtown is on the far right, and you can see kind of Beverly Hills on the far left there, West Hollywood. And a lot of this was, if you look the right third is probably already established. The left third, a lot of that was proposed essentially to bring a more logical grid-like network on this. And the angle streets were often what were streetcar lines, okay? There was a lot of analytical work that went into these plans. So there were graphic images that showed traffic flows. So this is actually the lines get thicker where the traffic gets thicker. This is data for 1922 in the major traffic street plan. And a recurring theme is that there was inadequate space for accommodation of the growing number of automobiles. So the growth in automobiles was just seen as exogenous. It was just happening. We got to try and cope somehow. We got to widen these streets. We got to try and increase flows so we can manage this traffic. And so this was also a map showing the street widths of various streets in LA and proposals for where things were going to be expanded. All of those were proposed expansions. So you can see quite a few. And there was some suggestions of actual grade separation. It's kind of a precursor to freeways, grade separation of major boulevards. So these, if you look, this is sort of the center lane that would pass over the intersection. So if you want to turn right or left, you would get into the right lane, make a right or a left turn. If you wanted to pass through the intersection, you could go over that intersection. And it was where there was just too much on a perpendicular street to handle that. And sort of the thought that, well, the intersections are the bottlenecks, and we're gonna build these things over it. So as you can see, there's this gradual motion from more and more trying to accommodate cars as a way of eliminating congestion. So some of the important elements of this plan was a new street grid west of Western Avenue, the introduction of broad boulevards, Pico and Wilshire, increasing electronic signalization, starting from less than 30 signalized intersections, introducing parking controls, and widening streets to standard widths based on this hierarchy. So that plan was, for the most part, implemented. Not the overhead passes over the intersections, but a lot of the elements of that, a lot of the network launched today was that major traffic street plan, which the designers said would really resolve congestion in Los Angeles, sort of once and for all. And as we know, it cleared up and we haven't had any congestion since then. So job done. So a year later came Plan 2. And that was by Kelker DeLeuw company. And it was a comprehensive rapid transit plan for Los Angeles. So a very different focus. And part of that was the question about a Union Station, which led to two referenda in 1926. There, the question was, is you had rail lines that were interurbans as well as intercity, coming into various parts of Los Angeles. This happened in many cities, and they dropped people off all over. And what did it make sense to have a Union Station where all of them came into one central place? And this was heavily debated and whether it should be near the plaza site. And if you know where the plaza is and where Union Station is, you know the answer of this, is that ultimately it was passed and built. So this plan specifically touched on that issue, but also had a comprehensive proposal to upgrade the best parts of the red car system, the Larry system, and connect them to new high-speed rights-of-way. So for the fastest growing urban areas suffering with chronic traffic congestion, the comprehensive plan offered the hope of uniformly high level of mass transportation over the entire region. So Union Station was approved by voters in 1926. It opened in 1939. So even back then, we were so good at delivering infrastructure investments very quickly. And as Marty Wax pointed out, it opened just as the whole system of intercity passenger rail was kind of declining. And so its recent years have been its highest levels of use prior to the pandemic. So it was never kind of led up to what had happened if it had been open in 28, for example. So it removed grade intercity train tracks, allowed for interline transfers, and connected intercity rail to local transit options, which it still does today. This plan also proposed rapid transit that was put before the voters. It called for tunnels in the center of the region. One short subway tunnel already existed and is still there. It elevated transit over many boulevard crossings, so that was easier to do than the whole roadway, and at grade in other areas. It proposed an extensive two-stage network estimated an astounding cost of $320 million. I couldn't believe that was right. I just went back and looked it up over the weekend. And indeed it was. So that was equivalent of $5.9 billion in 2025 dollars. And it proposed to use value capture, basically to do tax increment financing around the stations to pay for it, which was a pretty optimistic proposal. That went before the voters as well about whether they wanted to fund that with most of the funds being recouped through value capture. This was put together. I found this that our own Mark Garrett here put this map together to essentially, because no one had, to show the red is all of the improvements to the central part of the Kelker DeLeuw plan, and it connected to those black lines, which were the existing lines more at surface level. It was put on the ballot in 1926. There was a Citizens Anti-Elevated League, quite a name. And its opposition to the finance eviction of value capture as socialistic in the wake of the Russian Revolution. And the measure was defeated. So the major traffic street plan was implemented, but the rapid transit plan was not. Okay, so that's the first two. Meanwhile, development continued, and on it went. So the Depression and World War II were a major interruption to planning and building and the explosive growth of Los Angeles. But there were lots of war-related industries that were still bringing people to the area. It was a center of war production in the harbor and a point to send troops into the Pacific Theater. After the war, production workers and military personnel, many stayed or returned after seeing the pleasant climate in Southern California compared to their North Dakota home, for example, and the population growth is dramatic. The congestion returned despite the street plan implementation. And driving, as it turns out, was pretty resilient during the Depression. In part, at the time, these tended to be higher income drivers. We still saw gradually the automobile working its way down the income ladder. So the first big highway project in LA was the Arroyo Seco Parkway. It was later renamed the Pasadena Freeway. It was a Depression era public works project. It was later still, the name was changed back to the Arroyo Seco. It did operate as a parkway other than a modern freeway, but was oriented essentially to get people to and from between Pasadena and downtown. Those of you who've been down there may have gotten off and noticed that it says it recommend 5 miles an hour for this exit. And you see the skid marks as you come off. So it was not designed for high-speed travel. Now, plan number 3 was from the Auto Club. And I think it's a testament to both the influence of these sort of private interest organizations in Los Angeles and the ubiquity of colored pencils in planning at the time. Because essentially, if you look at this map and you look at the red lines, which they identified as places that would be good spots to build freeways, it should be awfully familiar. And again, this is from the Auto Club, and the green lines were other state highways, usually surface level. So you can see even the Century Freeway there, which is a green line, but a pretty familiar look. And this was a long time before these highways were built. I'm not going to say a lot about that other than it was sort of touted as by the Auto Club, which really was a club and sort of a club of auto enthusiasts at the time. It prompted lots of discussion, and the business community moved into action in the absence of government planning at that time, and essentially created another organization that kind of followed up to that. And at this time, you remember the histrionic editorial earlier. This is an LA Times editorial. The automobile designed to be an emancipator of people, which I didn't know that was the case, but to give people freedom in their movement so that they might be able to live where they please and work where they choose is defeating its own purpose. People are being enslaved again by the servant they've created. The emancipation is becoming a mockery and a memory. Traffic is becoming slower and slower. Automobiles are becoming thicker and thicker. Roadways are constantly becoming more inadequate. Business is suffering as a result. Citizens everywhere are clamoring in a confused way for relief from this state of things. They chafe at delays. They curse the lack of parking space. They bemoan the lack of customers in the center of trades. Eagerly, they're asking, what can we do? So this was 1938. And one thing is clearly it was a lot more fun to write editorials a long time ago than now. But beyond that, it kind of gives a sense of what the zeitgeist was around this change. So this brings us to Plan 4, which is the 1939 Transportation Engineering Board Plan. And that sounds very government and official, but again, this was a private organization. Sort of the equivalent of these things became things like the Regional Plan Association in New York, or SPUR, or the Bay Area Council in the Bay Area. Chicago have these. LA, these sort of died out. And I got to argue that it was visionary by almost any measure. Public transit was explicitly linked to freeway development, and a very different kind of freeway development. So here's a plan at sort of the LA County part. So you can see there is some familiarity, but more density in the center of these highways than in outlying areas. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see some of these highways. So the ones that have those dotted lines are streetcar lines. So you see that inside many of those parkways, and it was the best I could do to scan it, you can see the page there, had streetcars down the middle of, or elevated parts of these highways, and that there were other places where streetcars were to be improved. So it was really an effort to improve, get a lot of traffic into these higher capacity facilities, but also to speed streetcar travel a lot. There is some legacy of this. This is part of the Hollywood Freeway, which now I think that center area is like a storage facility is in the center, but that was actually part of red car operations down the middle of the highway. And even downtown, this was a look. You can see up at the top there with the ox. That's the square opposite where there's a station there. Like, am I blanking? Pershing Square, yes. But so you can see it's a denser flow. There were proposals for doing air rights development. So this was going to be sunken facilities, and part of the way they would finance it is actually build buildings over them. They had ideas for you would actually drive right off the roadway right into the parking structure that was built into the building. They had, all sorts of clever and creative ideas to try and cope with things. So it planned what was an extensive and comparatively dense network of small-scale grade-separated highway facilities. There was advanced right-of-way acquisition was an important part of this. Joint development was a key part. There were modest speeds into interchanges. It was going to be designed for 35 to 55 miles an hour, and not the 70 miles an hour that we see design speeds today. It was explicitly linked to rapid transit improvements. There was public ownership of the right-of-way, and then allowing companies to then go on there and bid to be able to use the right-of-way, which there was a problem with kind of monopoly operations by streetcar companies. They would act like monopolists once they had owned the tracks in a public right-of-way. And multiple operators were permitted on the rights-of-way. So this 1939 plan was arguably ahead of its time. And in fact, many of the things in it are things that were subsequently adopted decades later. But why wasn't anything like this, remotely like this, ever built? Well, there is a book I can recommend on that topic that you can take a look at that goes into it in considerably more detail than I can here. It doesn't focus just on LA, but just to take a few nuggets out of that, and let me do a time check here, okay? The freeways we drive on today were far different than those envisioned by early planners. So the things I was showing you, and I'll show you a few graphics of it now, are very different than what we do in terms of scale and the density of the network. And different especially from those proposed by the Transportation Engineering Board in LA. And they today much more, if you look at the Santa Monica Freeway, the 405 Freeway, they're more familiar with the superhighways that were planned to connect Chicago and St. Louis, and not what planners in LA and many other cities were proposing for their cities. So this is sort of a picture of things that were envisioned. In comparison to modern freeways, they were smaller facilities that, usually 2 lanes in each direction. They had very simple interchanges because they didn't want to take up a lot of land. They were configured in denser networks so that you didn't have to go as far to any of them, so the network was spread out much more. And living adjacent to it would be very different than living adjacent to, say, the 405 today. And they were closely tied to existing boulevards and arterials. They were often explicitly linked to land use. There were lots of joint development proposals. Some were multimodal with separate rights-of-way for trucks, buses, or trains. But while all this was going on, these plans were being developed, the feds were planning on adopting what was the 1944 Interregional Highways System, which, if any of you kind of have U.S. history in high school, they'd say, well, the Interstate Freeway System came about in 1956. It was actually adopted in 1944 as the Interregional Highways Plan. They just didn't fund it until 56. So it languished for about 12 years. So this looks pretty familiar for those looking at an interstate highway map. But in that plan in 1944, the people who sat on the committee were a lot of prominent urban planners, some of whom had actually done the major traffic street plan back in 1924 in LA. And the strong presence of urban planners had a notably strong regard for urban highways and city planning. So essentially, this plan said the selection of routes for inclusion in the interregional system within and in the vicinity of cities is properly a matter for local study and determination, sort of deferring to local urban planning officials. It says elsewhere, the interregional routes, however they're located, will tend to be a powerful influence in shaping the city. Improperly located, they will become more and more of an encumbrance to the city's functions, an all too durable reminder of planning that was bad. Okay, so just saying that the highway officials shouldn't be running these highways through cities, it needed to be city officials. But there was no funding to build this national system of superhighways, nor was there funding to build these urban highways either, so the grand plans devised by this Interregional Highway Committee remain just that, plans. Cities and counties in the Depression and in the Second World War relied mostly on special assessments and property taxes for transportation. And this foundered greatly in the Great Depression and even during the Second World War. Meanwhile, California and the feds relied mostly on fuel taxes for highways between cities, and this fared really well during the Depression and the Second World War. So without any money, cities and their planners turned to states and the federal government for metropolitan freeway planning and development. They basically said, you guys get the bucks, we don't. Can you do this? So control of metropolitan freeways shifted from cities and planners to states and engineers. Okay? So in the 1940s, California agreed to raise highway user taxes, mostly the gas tax and some other things, to begin construction of the 1939 Transportation Engineering Board Expressway Plan on the condition that the State Highway Department control all metropolitan expressway development. In other words, they told the city, yeah, we're going to take your plan and we're going to implement it, but only if we do it. We get to control it. And this included taking all of the transit elements out of the highway plan. So they wanted to strip it out. Why? And I'm not making this up. They were concerned that the new highways might not generate enough traffic if they had to compete with transit. So they were worried that transit was going to pull too many. Like now, if transit's zipping around the region, why would you want to drive? So we're worried we're going to build these highways and they'll be underutilized. So City officials subsequently tried to go around them and put the transit elements of the plan on the ballot in LA County. But they were denied permission to do so by the state legislature. So people in LA were going to be given the option to pay their own taxes to keep the transit element in that expressway plan. And they were denied to do that by the California legislature. They were not given permission to do that. So the Interregional Highway Transit Plan was killed, and it became the Interregional Highway Plan. So adopted in 1944, but not meaningfully funded until 56, the federal government generally wanted to fund its interstate system. But the problem was they couldn't get the support of urban legislators because they just saw these blank holes around their cities. Why should I vote for this thing? Looks like a rural program. So contrary to the recommendations of that Interregional Highways Plan, the urban freeway planning took only 9 months, and a thing called the Yellow Book was produced. So essentially, they raced around and just drew in lines and said, okay, here's the urban plan. Can we get this passed? And indeed, they did. So you'll remember this is the kind of plan for LA with all of that transit woven in. This is the plan they had for LA in the Yellow Book, which it looks like they kind of took a Sharpie and drew some lines that are similar to what they saw there, but again, no transit in this, and much more sparse, right? That network is much sparser than the one we saw before. So meanwhile, up in Sacramento, California was developing an even more ambitious freeway plan by the California legislature, and it was adopted in 1958. And I want to zoom in a little bit on this. So this plan said on freeways influence the suburban fringe, the new freeway will preserve capacity to move traffic and avoid low-value string development with consequent deterioration of public investment in highways. In other words, we might have some effect on development, and that's a problem. So we're just gonna essentially have very few interchanges so that it won't be affecting that development. And they said the primary function of a statewide freeway system provide relatively rapid through traffic surface for longer distance trips in the most direct and economical manner possible. I can tell you that they offered no rationale for why long trips were more important, why these trips had to run through the center of cities, but that's what they said. So again, LA, San Francisco, San Diego were to be blanketed by a freeway network on a 4-mile by 4-mile grid. This is the plan for LA. I call it, you get a freeway, you get a freeway. And if you look, all of those lines are not roads. All of those lines are freeways. Just soak that in a little bit. That's what's proposed. So when I said that half the plan was built, is I'm going to skip ahead and say they ran out of money to build this thing and ran into political opposition. But that was the proposal for what LA would look like, including the Simi Valley. You can see everywhere into the desert. Quite a remarkable plan. So what happened is that you started retrofitting freeways into LA, and it ran into all sorts of problems. These freeways were getting wider and wider because what we were doing is we had fewer and fewer roads, and we're trying to cram more and more capacity into them. So we're making them bigger, and that started to create problems. So this essentially looks at the rise and fall of freeway development in California. It peaked in about 1966 when pro-freeway Governor Ronald Reagan was elected, and then anti-freeway Jerry Brown was elected, you can see, and then pro-freeway Duke Majan elected, had almost no bearing on what was built. So costs went up, drastically controlled freeway development, increasingly unpopular displacements, disproportionately of low-income households, immigrants, and people of color, in order to retrofit freeways into cities. It just unraveled political support for them, and we're now left with a sparse network of very high capacity freeways carrying staggering amounts of traffic. Enormous, noisy, polluting freeways are public health hazards today. And as the new routes have been abandoned, we've crammed more and more road capacity into existing freeways, making it more and more of a problem to live or work or play near them. Which is almost exactly the opposite of what the early LA highway and transit planners proposed. Almost exactly, just like you said this, we'll do the opposite. So I'm going to close by asking you to imagine a world where LA is laced with a dense network of much smaller scale, 2 to 3 lanes in each direction at the most, much slower speed grade separated roadways, almost all of which include grade separated rail and bus transit, which might today also include truck-only facilities, which were discussed in the plan but not laid out specifically, and congestion tolls that subsidize the transit service. And we can imagine another world where the cost of electricity is bundled into annual property tax levies. So no matter how much or how little electricity one uses, the tax is paid is the same. There'd be no incentive to use electricity judiciously. Shortages would be chronic. We'd have brownouts and rolling blackouts every weekend, morning and afternoon. There'd be campaigns to encourage people to use more candles. We would accept this as the natural state of affairs. It's part of life in the big city, we'd say. And we might either fret that we don't have enough funding to build more power plants, or lament that more people weren't adopting electricity light lifestyles. Some might suggest, well, meter that electricity to encourage more judicious use of it. But many would dismiss this as unrealistic. People need electricity, and we can't really conserve, they'd say. It might hurt poor people, so we have no choice but to give electricity free to everyone, rich and poor. Welcome to our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We can do a Q&A period. You want to take a seat or you want to be up there? Okay. Are there any questions for Professor Taylor? If so, there is none. He's answered all your questions. I'll have, one in the back here.
Hi, Professor Taylor. Thank you for your presentation. I was really interested in what you said earlier about how LA fits neatly in between like a more New York, Boston type of more walkable development and stuff we see in more Sunbelt cities like Houston and Phoenix. Are there other advantages you see to now that LA is building more transit, that it's easier to do it here than say in a city like Phoenix because it's more in that in-between stage?
Yeah, I think that, here, no, I can just hold this. Oh. Yeah. Is that better? Okay. So, yeah, there is an advantage. I mean, one of the images is that LA is a really, really low density place, and it's not. It's a really, really super medium / high density place. But its density is very different than a place like New York, which is vastly higher in Manhattan, but whose suburbs are much lower density than LA on average. And part of that is the nature of that early streetcar development. Part of it is the fact that you need to connect to water systems. I think it was Mike Manville right here and Donald Shoup who said that New York is like Hong Kong surrounded by Phoenix, and Los Angeles is like LA surrounded by LA. And I think that if I've got that right, Mike, did I get it pretty close? So the idea of this moderate level of density has enormous potential for travel by other means, but it's not necessarily unlocked, in part because I think there's significant pressure to actually increase the density of development in the center parts of the region. I would submit that over the last 15 years, if we had just suddenly gone Houston and just taken away land use controls, we'd be seeing cranes everywhere between the Santa Monica Pier and Pasadena, for example, building at much higher densities, all of which would make it harder and harder to drive in those places and easier to walk and use transit. So it has this potential, but that is really capped. So in many ways, we're developing a lot of the transit capacity, but not allowing the kind of inclinations of development to urbanize what the streetcar suburb into a more urban place over time.
So, Brian, I know that you have.
I saw a hand.
Another hand over here. Okay, well, I'll start a question. I know you have experience with both LA and the Bay Area. How would you compare the development of the highway system in these two of California's major regions? Brian's is? Yeah.
Mine is? It's really low? Okay, I'll hold it closer. Is that better? How about now?
Good.
Early on, both regions were super gung-ho for new highways. In fact, if I can call out and defend Caltrans here, there were proposals that were originally drawn up for the region that, remember when Caltrans took control of these urban highway plans, they X'd out a lot of the proposed freeway development in San Francisco, saying it's just these freeways are not congruent with the city of San Francisco. The amount of displacement that need to occur is just really problematic. And San Francisco officials and my mentor at UC Berkeley, David Jones, did a lot of historical research on this, said, oh, no, you don't. Everybody else is getting their freeways. We want our freeways too in San Francisco. So there was just gung-ho enthusiastic for them. And so Caltrans reluctantly drew in lines that became freeways that decades later were much celebrated when they were taken down. And not all of them were completed. And if I zoomed in, you would see a shocking amount of high-rise double-deck freeway development proposed for San Francisco. And when those came down, Caltrans was beaten about the head and shoulders quite severely. And I'm not going to be the most frequent defender of our State Department of Transportation, but in this case, they really didn't want to build freeways in San Francisco, and they really did do enormous displacement. But the rest of the region was relatively low density, and freeway development proceeded apace. Again, not all of the lines were completed. Like one part of it, if I could, I'd show you. But there was a second crossing of the bay north that they said this will work out really great. What we'll do is there's this Angel Island. We're just going to deck it and just use that to fill across the bay, and we're going to put a new freeway that will go over Alcatraz and then on this land bridge over to and right up through Tiburon. So we'll have two freeways going across the bay there. And when I took my first traffic engineering course at UC Berkeley in 1984, we were tasked with building a freeway-to-freeway interchange over some sensitive wetlands in the bay, where we ran pilings over, and then engineers came in and critiqued our traffic designs, and it was just given that was something that they would do. So there was a plan to actually run freeways through the wetlands up on both sides. Those were not built. So you can say that the Bay Area dropped those, but there were so many freeways dropped out of the LA plan as well. With the exception of San Francisco, I don't think there was that much difference in the scale and density of the plans proposed.
Okay, right here.
Yeah. Hi. My name is Solbok, and then one question I had is that by looking at all these maps that you have shown about the historical plans of Los Angeles, including the red core networks and even the proposed highway plans, all seem to have this almost hub and spoke like nature of every roads end up to downtown. However, when we look at our Los Angeles right now and a lot of urban developments, they seem to be kind of spreading outside of downtown, just all over the place, which is directly, I think, is against the hub and spoke method. So I was wondering why there is that kind of mismatch between the importance of downtown as being central piece in the highway planning or any transit planning, as opposed to what we see here today with all the real estate development where it's kind of going outside of downtown.
That's an excellent question. So I think that there's a two-part answer to that. One is that that early on, most movement was by foot and by streetcar and by coming in via railroad. So there had to be some central meeting point. And so these lines going out, like lines of uncooked spaghetti going out and in the spokes of a wheel, was sort of the nature of development. And the highest access point was usually at the center of the city. And so as those systems, which were very linear in character, formed, you had these interstitial spaces where there was less development and development would go out on, you saw those streetcar lines. That was the nature of that transportation system, and it influenced dramatically the patterns of development. Secondly, the people who were proposing these plans, remember, they were sort of private industry groups. A lot of them were people who held land in the central part of the city that was the most valuable, and they were interested in protecting their investment. But transit systems actually do work well around sort of that central hub and spoke structure. If you saw that very last plan I showed you, remember the 4 mile by 4 mile grid? Again, boy, it sounds like I'm on the Caltrans. Caltrans essentially argued that, well, with all this automobile travel, there's a disadvantage with centering activity. And we think that cities are going to become more polycentric over time. We suggest this more grid format, that we don't see everything sort of emanating out of downtown. but being distributed around the region. And so that's why we're proposing this more grid-like plan rather. And if you saw that Transportation Engineering Board plan, it was centered on downtown. So it had a little bit of a grid quality. So that last plan really was an extraordinary grid, like a super grid of freeways that was specifically designed to try and assume, A, that most people would be getting around in cars, B, concentrating cars in big centers like downtown would be problematic, and C, the best way to distribute a system where most people are traveling by car was to distribute it around the region. So there was that distinction between those earlier plans and the last one that was proposed.
Was that the Department of Highways at that time, or was that
Division of Highways?
Division of Highways? So it wasn't called Caltrans. So you, but I'm rather prescient because that's what's happened in LA's and other places. Polycentricity. Right here, we have a question.
Test. Hello. Hi, Professor. My name is Josue Hervey Yu. So growing up in LA, it's almost like an urban myth that Big Auto bought up all of Pacific Electric and tore it down. I'm not sure if that's because of the 1988 film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but I was wondering if you can elaborate more on why that's the common theme.
Well, you have to remember that most public transit in this era was private for-profit transit. And one of the things I talk about in the 250 class is that that much of the money was made by private developers developing land around the extended streetcar lines. The money was made on those Pacific Electric lines that were run out there and suddenly made that land, farmland, accessible to the city. And the killing was made in selling off those lots of what farmland turned into be residential housing and other kinds of access. So they made a lot of money with that. Just operating the services were never big money makers. It's expensive to operate these services. There were lots of rules that it required a flat 5-cent fare, for example. And over time, the trips were becoming longer and longer so that the inflation-adjusted revenues per mile, a passenger mile, were going down, down, down. So that they got into financial trouble. So part of it was that at this time, you started to see these bankruptcies. There was a company called National City Lines and some others that were buying up streetcar companies and we're converting those streetcars to diesel buses. Okay, that's absolutely true. And it was a consortium of people who bought these. So it was Firestone, it was Standard Oil, it were a variety of other sort of what we might call auto industry interests that were interested in buying these. And so you could see if you've got this kind of consortia of auto-oriented interests that are buying up these lines, converting them to buses, and you have the decline of these systems, that story kind of puts together. So as I try and talk about in some of those of you that had that class with me, is that there really was a conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy to try to monopolize bus sales and diesel bus sales and to kind of drive electric trolley buses, which use the overhead wires that were replacing all the streetcars, out of business. And that the way they know that is that the streetcar companies that weren't purchased by National City Lines converted to diesel buses at exactly the same rate as those that were. So it was kind of an industry-wide phenomenon. And a part of that was a strange thing that had a lot of some of the earliest unionization in the whole industry was of transit. A lot of this is around the First World War because there was tremendous abuse. It used to be that if you were a streetcar operator and you were robbed and all the fare money was taken, it came out of your paycheck until it was repaid. So there was just all sorts of abuses by the companies. So unionization required that there'd be a conductor and an operator on that. The buses didn't have that in their contract. So even though a bus requires more attention than a streetcar in terms of navigating, they could have one worker on the bus. So that lowered operating costs a lot. So there are all sorts of things that mitigated in favor of that. Plus, extending streetcar lines farther and farther out in the suburbs got fewer and fewer passengers and became less economically reasonable. So there was a series of things that were combining the flat fare, these sorts of conversions, that caused that to happen. And so it was a conspiracy. In many ways, it was a successful conspiracy, as we have very few electric trolley buses now. But it was not as though car sales were struggling and they needed to kill transit in order to do it. The car sales were also going gangbusters. So there's not evidence why you'd want to spend a lot of money to do that. was trying to find a new niche market, which was these buses. So it was a conspiracy, but it wasn't quite the one that was portrayed in Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Okay, last question over here. Can you wait for the microphone? So, because we literally have dozens of people joining online, dozens or bots or something.
Shout out to the dozens. Could either of you speak to where we're at for Measure HLA? And then a smaller question of, in its prime, like how quickly could you get with the streetcar from, say, Long Beach to downtown LA?
Okay, I can answer the second one. I will defer to Juan or Mike Manville on the first one. So the second one is that the streetcars were much faster early on than later, for two reasons. One is that that trip from Long Beach to downtown, the middle 3/4 of it was farmland. And so it would work its way to the edge of Long Beach and then cruise along at 45 miles an hour all the way up to a few miles south of downtown Los Angeles, and then it would slow down again. Gradually, that all filled in. There were more stops. There was more dwell time at stops as people boarded and lighted. So that just slowed things down. And then operating that stretch, a lot of that was in that right-of-way I showed. But when they would get to into Long Beach or get to LA, they were then on the streets, and more cars were slowing things down as well. So over time, the utility of traveling on the streetcar was going down, 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 which is what the 1926 plan proposed to address and what the 1939 plan proposed to address. Neither of those were implemented. Okay, so over time, it not only was struggled to be competitive with the automobile, but it was actually being undermined by the automobile, which accelerated the movement away from the streetcar because we just didn't make the improvements. And one thing I want to mention is a lot of the opposition to those improvements is they were often seen. Scott Bottles, he got a PhD in history here. He argued that the streetcar companies were private, and because they were not making a lot of money, they were sort of net disinvesting from the streetcars. They're putting money into electric utilities. They're putting money into other things. And so their cars were being run down. The service got worse. And they were just seen as greedy monopolists. They were not popular. And you could tell from that one editorial I read way back in 1913 as to that. So yeah, there was not less enthusiasm about bailing out transit because transit was a privately owned and operated system at that time. And it was seen as bailing out, robber barons. You want to answer?
Oh, HLA. Well, HLA saw what was proponents may have thought was an administrative problem and maybe solve the administrative problem, but it seems that the delivery of multimodal transportation infrastructure in Los Angeles is more of a systemic problem having to do with governance and not administration, or not just administration. Mike, did you have anything to add as a follower of the HLAs? A microphone is coming to you. And you can always drop the mic after you're done.
I'd heard it. Is this on? Yeah, okay. I think two things. One is that it's hard to evaluate HLA's progress because it hasn't been in place for very long, and then the city entered its financial crisis. And so HLA's provisions are triggered when the city does scheduled road work. A lot of that has been pushed off because the city is in a fiscal emergency, which is likely to get worse if the current investigation into the source of the Palisades fire finds what they think is going to find, in which case the city could be liable for all the damage in Pacific Palisades. So large capital projects in Los Angeles are probably going to be proceeding at a very lower rate. I'd also just to piggyback on what Juan said, HLA was a good idea. I voted for it, but it's a good example of how difficult a problem is when you can't bind a government to what it says it wants to do. Because the point of HLA was not to force the government to do something entirely new. It was to implement a plan the government itself had already passed. And so even if you pass a measure saying that now the government really has to do that,
This time we mean it.
yeah, there's no mechanism in place to make it do it short of suing the government, which is a very complicated thing. So what Michael Schneider was really counting on was that this good electoral showing would just make the elected officials behave better. But we live in Los Angeles.
Yes. Okay. And we've just learned about 100 years of, well, about 50 years of 24 to 58 fighting traffic congestion in Los Angeles. And I think what we've learned is that not every plan is implemented and not every plan should be. Yeah. So can you join me in thanking Professor Taylor for his talk today? Thanks. And we have not done this for all of our speakers, but not all of our speakers spent 25 years helping to build an institution of people coming together and talking about plans and things they agree with or disagree with. And then not every speaker would, yes, you can go ahead and open that now. And not every speaker would be gracious enough to say, hey, there's something wrong on here. Can you give it back to me in a year?
What? I did?
So this is a plaque acknowledging Brian Taylor's support for the UCLA Arrowhead Symposium. Oh no, we got it and we were about to give it to you. Whitney knows the story. Whitney.
And so it took us a whole year to get it remade, and we just wanted to make sure that we make sure you had it.
So this is the last talk this fall, but UP 297, as Adam mentioned, does continue into the winter and into the spring.
This was past. Winter is the present.
The winter is the present. Then the spring is the future. And let's hope we make it to the spring. All right.